King first published the American Dispensatory with the president of the Eclectic Eclectic Medical Institute of Cincinnati, Robert Newton, in 1852. And following that, they were all kind of strong-willed, bull-headed doctors, and that's one thing that helped make them eclectic, I guess, was, defy convention. Anyway, they had a falling out. I think that Newton left the college, and so King, in the process of that breakup, King, well, had also left college anyway. He followed up by rewriting the subsequent editions under his name as the American Dispensatory. It became known as King's American Dispensatory after his death in 1894, I believe, 93, 94. And when Felter and Lloyd revised King's old American Dispensatory, they entitled it King's American Dispensatory, and that was after they had made their revisions to it. So that was, the American Dispensatory was the eclectic profession's standard of practice, I guess you'd say. One thing that Felter noted when they revised King's Dispensatory as opposed to his Materia Medica was that included in that was all of the drugs and medications that eclectics would use. Not that they would use them often or frequently, but it was kind of, this was their formulary from which they would draw their herbs and guidelines for practice. And so when Felter devised his own Materia Medica, he really reduced that down to the things that he felt were most important. But when you're writing a book that's representative of the profession, you try and make it as expansive as possible so that it includes everyone's style of practice within that profession. That's why it's such a large text. It even includes some of the mineral drugs which eclectics in principle opposed, but would on occasion use, even though it would be on rare occasion. They are included in that as well as the botanicals. Well, Finley Ellingwood was, he wrote his first Materia Medica in the late 19th century, about the time that Felter and Lloyd were revising King's American Dispensatory. And Ellingwood also ran a publication called Ellingwood's Therapeutist. And what that was a eclectic periodical which served kind of as a clearinghouse for eclectic medical doctors to express their clinical opinions on different botanical remedies. And so he would accumulate these and report them in his periodical. And as a medical editor, and it's interesting because that was the same role that Felter had with a periodical put out by the Lloyd brothers called The Gleaner. He served as not only editor, but there were many letters to the company, people commenting about their results of the medication. So it was through this exchange of communication about clinical experiences with the different extracts that there was a body of knowledge built up about the benefits and the limitations of some of these herbs. The thing to realize about eclectic medical practice using Native American plants is that these extracts were distinct from the forms which they were used by Native Americans. The indigenous peoples would use the whole fresh plant, or if they dried the mostly roots and barks for storage for winter use, they would be using water extracts of these plants. And when the Eclectics incorporated Native American plants into clinical practice, companies like Lloyd Brothers or Parker Davis were making hydroalcoholic extracts. Now, when you use alcohol as part of the solvent to extract the herbs, you're extracting different principles. So in essence, they really had to kind of rediscover the properties of these extracts because they weren't identical to what had traditionally been used by the indigenous people. And so what that required was communication of doctors letting one another know, well, I tried it on this and had good results, and if they reported good results, other doctors would try for that and report back. And so it was on the basis of these communications through the Gleaner in Cincinnati, edited by Felter, and Ellingwood's Therapeutics in Chicago, edited by him, that if you read the preface to their books, you'll see that that's where they drew a lot of the information from their Materia Medicas were on these communications by practitioners to these journals which they edited, and then they basically acted as compilers, and then of course they would make their own editorial decisions as to what was worthy of inclusion or not. Very often in Ellingwood's Materia Medica, he would identify those doctors who were the ones to initiate a certain claim or observe a particular effect which he felt was noteworthy. Another distinction between Ellingwood and his Materia Medica, which if I have this right, I believe Ellingwood's was called the American Materia Medica Therapeutics and Pharmacognosy, and Felter's was the Eclectic Materia Medica Pharmacology and Therapeutics. Similar sounding names and similar books in terms of their content. What Ellingwood did that I really like and value in his text from 1919 is that he organized the herbs by organ systems, so that similar acting remedies were grouped together. Those for treating fevers, those for treating the GI tract, those for treating the heart, nervous system, and so forth. And also in the back he had a therapeutic index which would key certain conditions, would note the pages on which those discussed. When you go to that page, those conditions are in bold type, so it's very easy to reference things if you're trying to find what herbs are used to treat a particular condition. In the therapeutic index, all of those herbs will be listed in the specific page on which that term is used in bold. So it's a really easy way for a user of the text, which is still very popular Materia Medica today, to identify and locate that information. Felter, on the other hand, used the kind of American dispensatory format of listing everything alphabetically, and so you kind of, it's a book more designed to study certain herbs as opposed to maybe look up uses of herbs. And another great advantage of Felter's book is he has a 100-page introduction in which he discusses the whole principles and practice of eclectic botanical medicine. It's extremely useful. Ellingwood's Materia Medica, his front piece was written by Lloyd, where he discusses the different types of preparation and the importance of some of the pharmaceutical distinctions, and discusses eclectic medicine. So my recommendation to anyone who's interested in this tradition of eclectic medical practice, get both of those books, because they're really nice complements for one another. The areas of agreement are great, but they also have different points of emphasis, and it's real helpful to kind of compare and contrast information about a particular herb, looking at it each way. And then others would argue that you should just stick with King's American Dispensatory. This is the most comprehensive and has contributions from both Felter on clinical issues, based on King, who was always recognized in Cincinnati as the master practitioner, and then his student Felter kind of refining and updating that information, and Lloyd giving some of the chemistry and pharmacy. So in some ways that's the most complete text, but it's also a little more dated. It's 20 years older, but when a book's 100 years old, does it make a difference if it's 80 versus 100? Yeah, in some ways it does. They did, build their knowledge base in a several decade period, but they're all great books, and any one of them is worth having, and probably, having all the volumes is best if you have that extra cash laying around in a drawer somewhere.
After the Civil War, John Milton Scudder, who is a relatively young eclectic physician at this point, almost single-handedly resurrects eclectic medicine. He and John King find this young chemist who they're very, very interested in. Even though he has no real formal training, he's apprenticed for quite a few years, but he has no university education, and this guy's name is John Uri Lloyd. And they tell him, they said, look, if you're going to work with us, you're going to be tarred by the odium of eclecticism. In the sense that everybody's going to not want to deal with you who's allopathic because you're working with us. And Lloyd says he doesn't really care. He has great respect for Scudder. He has great respect for King. And they set out to create the greatest herbal medicines that have ever been made, and maybe succeeded. They call these specific medicines. In 1870, Scudder publishes his monumental work called Specific Medication, setting out the new theory of eclectic medicine. Before that, eclecticism was just that, it was eclectic. The best of whatever you had. So they took from homeopathy, they took from, botanical medicine, from the Thomsonians, from the physiomedicalists, from allopathic medicine, whatever worked, and that was the best, as far as they're concerned, was the best, that was what they used. So now for the first time, there is now a unified theory of eclectic medicine, and the idea is to explore the materia medica, especially the American materia medica, but not entirely, and to find out what they call the black letter symptoms, the specific symptom pictures that allow you to understand exactly where a given herb is appropriate for a given patient. They even go as far to basically create labels for their specific medicines that Lloyd makes. They patent the labels, so nobody else can duplicate the medicines. If you see this label, you know it's a real medicine that has real activity. Now, one of the theories of eclectic medicine that's kind of interesting, because most people who know anything about eclectic medicine, the theory of specific medication was you use the specific medicine. So you're talking about simpling. You're talking about using a specific herb at a given time. That is the theory of specific medication. The reality of specific medication is that most people did not necessarily do that. Either they would alternate herbs, meaning 1 hour you'd give this herb, the next hour that one, and then back to the first herb. So you'd either alternate herbs, meaning you're using more than one, but you may be alternating them. But what also would happen is there were many classic eclectic medications from the old days of eclecticism, which people still had great faith in and still worked, which they continued using. And what you also find in the eclectic practice is, even though Scudder's theory lays it out as you use one herb at a time, most eclectic practitioners actually use simple formulas of 3 or anywhere from 2 to 4 herbs at a time. So the idea, even though the idea was to use this herb or that herb at a given moment, they were actually combining them. In some of the later books, you actually see quite a bit of this sort of combination of these simple formulas, usually with maybe three ingredients per formula. So that's where specific medication comes from. And then several years after his book Specific Medication, he follows that up with his book Specific Diagnosis, which I think comes out in 1872. And specific diagnosis is the diagnostic symptoms, because Scudder creates a whole system of tongue and pulse diagnosis, very different than, say, Chinese or Ayurvedic tongue and pulse diagnosis. In Chinese medicine, the pulses tell you if you have a bounding pulse, it's an excess pulse. If you have a certain tongue signs, it shows deficiency or excess or heat or cold or stagnation. Where Scudder's tongue signs and pulse signs indicate specific remedies. So there was the belladonna pulse and the aconite pulse, and there was the copper sulfate tongue. And so you have a very different system, but it comes as close to creating a true American system of medicine, meaning there's a whole theoretical framework with diagnostics. It's a system of medicine. And specific medicine was practiced from about 1870, and it continued to be practiced up until the 1930s at the very least. Here we have one of my favorite medicines. This is Collinsonia. The Latin name is Collinsonia canadensis. Now, in the eclectic literature, and this is very much an eclectic plant, in the eclectic literature, they talk very much about the fact that good Collinsonia needs to be made from the fresh root, the fresh leaf, and flower. And these aren't flowering yet. Unfortunately, in the commercial marketplace, most of the medicines made from Collinsonia are made from the dry root. But all of the flavonoids and all of the volatile oils are in the flowers and the leaves. And so Collinsonia makes a great medicine. It should be what's called aromatic Collinsonia, made from the whole fresh flowering plant, root, leaf, stem, flower. And this is a wonderful medicine. And the black letter symptoms, the specific indications, would be basically venous congestion with stasis and laxity of tissue. So for instance, we use it for benign prostatic hyperplasia in men. We use it for what's called minister's throat, a chronic low-grade irritation of the vocal cords. We use it for things like varicose veins. We use it for hemorrhoids. And it is a wonderful medicine that can be taken to help tonify tissue, to reduce laxity, to help increase circulation to the tissue. Here we have yellow dock, Rumex crispus. And yellow dock is an introduced plant, came with the Europeans, and the part used is the root. The root does have a nice yellow color, hence the name yellow dock. Yellow dock traditionally was used by the Eclectics for cachexia associated with cancer, the wasting associated with cancer. It's also used for dry coughs, and then another black letter symptom for yellow dock is skin conditions that are oozing, weeping with a serous discharge or pussy discharge. So it doesn't matter what you call the condition. You can call it nonspecific dermatitis, eczema, psoriasis. If it has an oozing discharge, you want to use Rumex. You can use it topically, and you can also use it internally as a tea or as a tincture.
Living in Tucson, Arizona, the University of Arizona School of Medicine has in their library the volumes from the California Eclectic Medical Journal, and it's interesting in reading through that the distinctive identity that the West Coast Eclectics had, distinct in some of their beliefs and practices from those in the Midwest. And in particular, while the Cincinnati school all revolved around specific medication and the use of the Lloyd brothers' specific medicines and those principles of practice, on the West Coast, at least the editors of this journal seem to want to emphasize that that wasn't the only way that Eclectics practiced. And on the West, Park Davis, the pharmaceutical company based in Detroit, investigated a lot of the West Coast plants and manufactured fluid extracts, which were one-to-one, fairly strong botanical extracts made from the dried plants. It seems like a lot of the California Eclectics would utilize or prefer the Park Davis fluid extracts. Some also, based upon their writings, employed Lloyd brothers' specific medicines, which were usually about a one-to-one potency too, but they were made from fresh plants. And so it was a competition for ideas and patronage, and people had different opinions then as they do now. And but it wasn't a uniform practice. My tendency before was to believe, because I was always reading the Materia Medicas out of Cincinnati, that's the way, that was eclecticism. Well, that was one manifestation. Ellingwood, Finley Ellingwood, who was based at Bennett College in Chicago, being close to Cincinnati was heavily influenced by that, but again, it's a slightly different emphasis and maybe a different brand of eclecticism being practiced there. So I think every school, most of the schools of eclecticism, there was an important one in St. Louis, one in Lincoln, Nebraska, one in Kansas City, and then one in San Francisco until the earthquake, and then they moved to Los Angeles. And so there was about a half a dozen eclectic schools that had some longevity. I think each school had its own identity. It's similar to my perception of the naturopathic medical schools now. Each one, different points of emphasis, a little different style of practice, and they together politically existed as eclectic medicine, but there was a lot of room to move within that context, a lot of different styles of practice.
When you look at the overall numbers of eclectics in the United States, let's say by 1900, it's deceptive. In 1900, there were probably 9,600, I think that's the closest I've been able to find, about 9,600 eclectics identified in the United States that were living at the time. Let me back up and say that there were probably about 8,600 homeopaths, about 1,500 physiomedicals, about 76,000 regulars. So you're really talking about a population of sectarian doctors, at least in those main areas, that amounted to about 21% or 21% of the total number of doctors, okay? Now, among the eclectics, I say that's deceptive for this reason. As I've been able to look at the students who went to the medical schools, I basically found three types of students. The first type were what I would call the sons and daughters of eclectic physicians, or people who had been treated by eclectic physicians, and were really true believers. They felt that regular medicine had failed. They objected to the heroic treatments that regular medicine had for so long subscribed to. And they didn't want to be held to the tyranny of any one particular medical school. That's why the eclectic borrow from whatever could be possible. This group was, we could say, maybe a third of those of the students in the medical schools. The second group were students who were what I call second chancers. These were students who had, usually young men, who had gone to a regular medical school and had flunked out, or at least were in sufficient academic trouble to know that they didn't have a future there, and they simply left. But still wanting to be a physician, either because of personal desire or parents' desire or whatever, chose to continue with medical education. These students transferred into the eclectic schools by the droves, and as a school of second chance. And I should say that most of them skimmed through. They were not great students, and they enjoyed having fun more than they had enjoyed the courses. The third group was a most interesting group to me: Orthodox Jews. And if you think of the time, late 19th, early 20th century, Orthodox Jews are coming into the country in large numbers, settling principally on the eastern seaboard, and moving into the schools, into the colleges. And they were moving into the medical schools in such numbers that schools like Columbia and others put quotas on those students. It's interesting because what you see is an entirely new set of criteria for admission. They want to know what your religion is now. They want a picture of you. They want to know what business your father was in, and your grandfather. And all of these questions that they ask were really to determine what your ethnicity and religious background was. Well, these Orthodox Jews, when they were frozen out of their medical education on the eastern seaboard, they moved then, or they found opportunities in the eclectic schools. And in the Eclectic Medical Institute, for example, in Cincinnati, in any given class, over half the students would have been Orthodox Jews. Now, and these students were good. They were very good. But like the second group, which were the young men who had come out of, who were academically in trouble and had moved out of regular schools into the eclectic schools, both those groups had no commitment to eclecticism as a philosophy. And remember that these are schools that are not supported by public taxes. And so they are dependent upon tuition and fees to sustain them. And here we have 2 out of the 3 groups of students who have really no commitment to this institution except for the degree, the MD. And so after these students, these 2 groups, leave the institute, graduating with the MD, the first thing they do is disassociate themselves from the school. They don't join the National Eclectic Medical Association like the first group. They don't contribute as alumni. They don't become donors through endowments or anything of that nature. As best they can, they remove themselves and any identification from eclecticism and just simply mainstream into orthodox medicine. And that's the problem. It was a school whose numbers vastly exceeded, I think, those who were really true believers in the system.